Hey everyone, it is patch day in the world of Hearthstone. There was a pretty big patch that was just announced with all the details on the Hearthstone social media and things like that. And I wanted to talk about it. And also, you'll notice that I haven't really played very much Hearthstone lately. And the reality is that I just haven't been having fun playing Hearthstone, and I've been playing other games instead. The reason for that has really been that the general play pattern of Hearthstone games has seemed to become something that I just don't really enjoy. It has largely been vomit out a bunch of stats in the very early turns of the game, or basically explode and kill your opponent in a single turn. And while I do think that the proposed nerfs, or not even proposed, the nerfs that are happening are going to do something to shift some of that, I am concerned that it won't necessarily do enough moving into the new expansion, The Great Dark Beyond. I really like what we've seen so far of The Great Dark Beyond. As you may have noticed from some of the clips floating around on Hearthstone's social media and such, I was among the group of people who had an opportunity to play some with The Great Dark Beyond early, and it was a blast. I had a tremendous time playing with this stuff, and it's exactly the kind of cards and kind of gameplay that I enjoy from Hearthstone, kind of like back and forth building up to things that has, sort of interaction, because you're building your starship and like setting it up and figuring out when you want to launch it and things like that. That's a ton of fun. But my concern is that even with this set of changes that's being launched today, there still will be a lot of the pretty toxic play patterns to that style of gameplay that will make it so that those sort of decks will not have the opportunity to succeed when the new expansion launches. So let's talk a little bit about what these changes are. Just looking at the patch notes that were released. First change is Yogg. Yogg going from 9 mana to 10 mana. This, I have to assume, is because the new expansion is about, hey, I'm going to build up a big starship and launch it. And if you just get to take my big thing I spent all this time building very easily, because Yogg's in basically every deck, then that sucks. While I am not necessarily a huge fan of the change sort of in a vacuum, I think that Yogg has been like a really interesting and fun card at 9. I do think in the context of a world in which people are building toward these individual big creatures, minions, whatever, on a regular basis, that having Yogg as a neutral mind control effect is probably a bad idea, at least as powerful as it is right now. So that's fine. Next change, Wondrous Wand. Wondrous Wand, instead of being draw 3, reduce their cost to 0, it's draw 3, reduce their cost by 3. This is one of the cards that has sort of been in the just vomit out a ton of stuff in a single turn sort of gameplay that I have personally found really frustrating. And one of the concerns that I have, that I think actually still remains a bit, that is related to Wondrous Wand, is how, like, neutral cards are basically colored by the existence of Druid. I think this is one of the major design issues that Hearthstone actually has suffered from for a very long time. It's that, cards like Yogg and like Meren, and that they are like, hey, basically build up to a big thing. They are very difficult to play in a lot of classes and very easy to play in Druid, because Druid has access to so much mana ramp. And, as we see even more and more mana ramp, and not only mana ramp, but mana limit breaking cards. If you look at like the current pool of Druid cards, like the average Druid deck can very easily play like 6 ramp cards. And, like some of those with New Heights increase your limit beyond the maximum. And that's sort of crazy. So it makes it so that any high cost neutral cards, are sort of problematic in Druid decks potentially, but are largely unplayable in a lot of other decks. One of the things about just the broad strokes design structure of Hearthstone that I think is very difficult to solve. A lot of people criticize, like, for instance, like the magic mana system, because, like you have games where you just don't draw lands, you draw all lands or whatever. But one of the things that it unlocks is this sort of opportunistic resource system that isn't just like, hey, you are playing this class, you get to do this. Like if someone wants to play ramp cards and, the equivalent of like, I don't know, priest or whatever, they can do that. If you want to play ramp cards with equivalent of hunter, they can do that, right? And the fact that like every other class is locked from ramp, with the exception now of Tourist and Warrior getting New Heights as well, it just creates this really strange pressure on designing high-cost neutral cards. And it's weird that I'm specifically talking about this with Wondrous Wand, but the sort of Meren specifically, in particular, was so powerful in Druid for 2 reasons. One, you could easily ramp to Meren and be able to use Wondrous Wand to then, like immediately cast it. but also because your deck is a ramp deck and gets to play a ton of high cost things, and thus you're very likely to draw high cost things off of Wand, which exacerbates its power level. This Wand change shifts that, right? Like, you don't just necessarily want to always Marin into Wand, because if you hit 10s, they only cost 7 instead of 0, which is a very big difference. So I think it shifts where Wand is good to a certain extent, or at least, you know, the way in which you want to use it. I do expect we'll generally see a lot less of Marin with this change, because Wand was the obvious go-to for the reasons of it mostly seeing play in decks that ramped to big stuff. Next up, we see Puppet Master Dorian going from 4 to 5 cost. This may not seem like a huge shift. It's just like, you know, going up in cost by 1, but it's actually massive. The biggest reason that it no longer is a hit off Oaken Summons. Hey, look, Druid with a neutral card. But the real issue here, and again, this is sort of a very much a Druid thing as well. You mostly saw Dorian in Druid decks, and mostly because Druid could ramp up and then play Dorian plus card draw spells in a single turn. I think Dorian will potentially still be a powerful card in a lot of these Druid decks because they can still ramp up and play Dorian and card draw spells, but it will not be a card that just comes down as like a, you know, a tutor effect off of an Oaken Summons, so you just have access to it a hugely higher percentage of the time than you would otherwise, right? So it becomes a card that, like, you have to actually draw instead of, you know, you just get to find from your deck and gain a bunch of armor as well. So I think this is a really important change. It is, again, I think it's unfortunate because I think that Dorian, outside of Druid decks, was an interesting card to play because it required investment and setup to try to, you know, like Dorian into whatever high cost minions. Like, I really liked playing Dorian in my my like Reno Demon Hunter deck, because hitting a lot of the high cost minions in that and be able to get duplicate copies of things like Kurtrus or Argus or whatever was always super cool. But like, you couldn't just do it with like Flower Child because you could easily get to 9 or 10 mana. You couldn't just do it with like Pendant of Earth or whatever, like on turn 4 or whatever, because you ramped so much. I think this is a good change, but again, I think this is something which showcases the sort of fragility of the neutral system in Hearthstone with respect to Druid having essentially sole access to mana ramp and what that does to these cards for other classes. Next up, Treasure Distributor. Treasure Distributor, you know, is going from when you summon a pirate, give it and this minion +1 attack, to just when you summon a pirate, give it +1 attack. I like this change. You know, I actually don't mind the aggressive decks being good as much as I mind like the combo decks being good, because I think that you can always play, you know, if like the most popular deck is an aggro deck that plays cheap minions, you can always play, you know, low cost removal to try and kill their cheap minions like this to, you know, gain more of an edge against them. But there isn't necessarily always a thing you can do at all against the combo decks in the format. Overall, I just think that the aggressive decks have just been a bit too fast. Treasure Distributor into Sigil of Skydiving has just kind of been ludicrous, and it's probably a good thing this is getting nerfed, just because you don't have to have tons of anti-aggro in every single deck just in case you run into one of these. Next up is Party Fiend, going from a 1 cost 1/1 to a 2 cost 2/1. I think this card went from being super good to being kind of trash. It's interesting because, yeah, this is a card that, you know, was obviously crazy powerful in the Painlock decks, because not only does it help you just like get an early board presence that can pressure the opponent, but chewing away at your life total and getting you closer to be able to play Imprisoned Horror or Molten Giant or the Flame Juggler, and powering those up are all really powerful. And I think that deck likely needed toning down as one of those vomit a ton of stats onto the board decks in the incredibly early turns of the game. And this, it may seem like a weird change, but Party Fiend I think is like one of the sort of like best cards to possibly have in your opening hand in that deck. And there's not really that many things you can play with on some of the other things. You have already nerfed Molten Giant, already nerfed, you know, Imprisoned Horror. Where do you actually move the needle on a lot of these things while keeping them remotely compelling? And I think that this being worse and making it so that, like, you know, maybe like mass production to 2 was another option, but this is also just like a very powerful card alongside like the Ziliax. You just play this plus Ziliax as like a, you know, previously it was like more or less a innervate to be able to play your Ziliax because it was generating mana, assuming you're playing the, you know, the +1 plus reduced by your dudes on board Ziliax. So I think overall probably like a very good change, even if it feels like a weird one. Crescendo is the next change, going from 2 to 3 mana. This is a change that I like. You know, when these cards were first released, they weren't that impressive. The Fatigue synergy cards, but the addition of like Popgar and the addition of Encroaching Insanity, the addition of Tidepool Pupil, those have all just given you so much ability to have consistency and repeated effects. And Crescendo, obviously the most powerful of the fatigue cards, obviously combines insanely well with Popgar. It crucially now also is not free with Popgar. That was one of those frustrating things in my mind of the sludge change. I sort of wish that they just would revert the sludge change, because, you never see those anymore, and B, Crescendo itself, even with this, like, it costs 1. I guess it would cost 1 anyway if you reverted that, and this is probably a better baseline nerf if that's just what you're targeting. But I hated the fact that like Popgar Crescendo became busted because they changed sludges, right? and made Popgar reduce spell spells by 2. But yeah, all the ability to like continue to create extra copies of Crescendo and to dig to it and to gain life off of it, have it be basically kill your board and Reno, all made Crescendo super frustrating to play against. And this is one of those cards that, like, this is less of a deck that I think that is problematic in terms of like stat explosion, though it can be with the 3/3s. It can play a pressure game off of Craze Conductor, but the really frustrating play pattern from this deck was pretty universally just getting crescendoed into oblivion in the late game. And this, at least, again, makes it not free with Popgar and makes it harder to fit into a turn where you're playing a bunch of other stuff as well, especially multiple copies. So I like this change quite a bit. Next up is Tsunami. Tsunami's just being reverted from 10 mana summon 4 water elementals to 8 mana summon 3 water elementals. This change in the first place was so strange to me, because this card was like buffed to 10 mana summon 4 water elementals at the same time, or like right before they introduced the Rogue Mage Tourist, right? The Mage Tourist to Rogue. It blows my mind that you'd look and be like, hey, Big Spell Mage isn't really performing very well. We're gonna buff it right before you make it so that like you're releasing these cards which make it outrageously explosively powerful, right? Like between Skyla itself and the access to Seashell and Conman, it just feels like an incredibly skewed way of analyzing the format's balance, right? Because you know that this is coming. You know that, hey, we're releasing this stuff that's going to make this much more powerful. Why would you buff Tsunami right before that? It makes no sense, right? Like you're like just asking for it to be a problem. If you're looking at like the current performance of stuff, I mean, the same thing happened with Metal Detector too, right? Metal Detector got buffed in the same patch as Tsunami, and then like, was suddenly available to mages who could use it to coin out, big spells and stuff. It feels so strange to me to make that balance decision before you see the results of the tourist cross that you're introducing with the mini set. I don't understand the motivation that goes into that. And I feel like, in some cases there's with the balance philosophy, or at least balance implementation in Hearthstone, that there's like kind of too much stuff thrown at the wall at once. You'll be like, hey, this is underperforming. And it's like, okay, we're gonna like both buff this and introduce all this new stuff. I mean, that's the same thing as like Razzle Dazzler, which is the next card on the list, right? Razzle Dazzler got buffed from 7 mana to 6 mana. At the same time, there was like the buttons buff and like a number of other things that like made those decks significantly more powerful as well. I honestly had never read Razzle Dazzler correctly until the buff. And I have to wonder if other people hadn't either. The fact that Razzle Dazzler is summon another 5-cost baseline and then repeat was something I didn't realize, because I never bothered playing it because it seemed bad at 7. And yeah, I do think Razzle Dazzler is like, one of those things, like, yeah, it's probably doing too much. But like, when you introduce it, all this at the same time as like the buttons change, I understand the motivation, because you don't have that many patch opportunities to, want to make an impact with these things. But sometimes it just feels like there's a little bit too much being done at any given time with respect to like the same class or group of classes or whatever. The same thing with like the Conniving Conman and Seashell. Those were both buffed, right? To be copy the last, reduce the next non-rogue thing, or copy the last non-rogue thing. And those were buffed right before, again, we had the new rogue crossover with Big Spell Mage. And that was pretty frustrating, when you are instead of replaying like whatever, Paladin card. And now there's a lot of really powerful things you can do with Paladin, as we're seeing with the Lanessa Pipsy decks that, people eventually did discover. That change right before introducing Skyla and having that crossover, like, just creates this very weird dynamic where like And that's another thing with the tourist cards. Like those aren't like you never see those played in rogue decks, right? The number of cards that like with the tourist mechanic are basically just for the other classes. Like I feel like Priest, for instance, basically has like almost no Priest cards. They have almost no cards from the recent expansion because so many of the cards are like things like acupuncture or whatever that are basically like intended for the Demon Hunter Priest crossover. They're all like these aggressive self-damage cards and things like that. Whereas like a like mid-range or controlling Priest deck basically got nothing from the set, with the exception of like Na Rain or whatever. Speaking of Priest, the final nerf in Standard is Injured Hauler, going from Overheal deal 2 damage to all enemy minions to Overheal deal 1 damage to all enemy minions. I think Injured Hauler has very clearly, like Overheal Priest specifically, has been too good for several patches now. It has been like among the best decks. It is the sort of deck that like I think at lower ranks, people don't necessarily respect because it is a difficult deck to play. I've seen a number of comments on this like, oh, why would you nerf this? It's not that good. Or like, you know, killing the only Priest deck, which I do think is at least some level of viable criticism because, as I mentioned, Priest didn't really get anything in the recent expansion for most strategies that it wants to try and play. But Injured Hauler, I think, is just like such an oppressive card against any kind of minion-based strategy. And in particular, if one of the goals going to the next expansion is to make a environment that is friendlier to playing on the board, which I appreciate a great deal. One of the things that I say a lot about specifically Magic, but is also relevant to Hearthstone, is that the only game rule level interaction that exists is through minions or creatures, right? A lot of people think of interaction as like a card that says it kills your other card. The baseline interaction is that you have guys with stats, they have guys with stats, and they can attack into each other. Like in Magic, it's attacking and blocking. In Hearthstone, it's like, you know, the decision to trade or go face, basically. That is the baseline level of interaction that exists in both games, and that is it. Everything else is like, does a card say it allows you to interact in some way? And that is, I think, a great example of why I feel like the OTK style decks and you know, combo from hand type strategies are so frustrating and create such a bad play experience, particularly going into an expansion that seems to focus on like mid to late game value board type stuff with starships and stuff like that. If you're like, you know, you're trying to promote like starships and building up your starship and deciding the right time to launch your starship and all that, in a world where people just kill you from hand on like turn 7 or 8 or whatever, you failed, right? Like you have a failed metagame that in which like the primary thing that you are promoting your set doing is pointless because it does not interact with what your opponent's doing, which is just exploding you from hand, right? And I think that there is a home in Hearthstone for a limited amount of like combo style decks because there's such a small amount of disruption that exists in the game. And I don't think that those sort of decks should never exist, right? I think that having a combo deck that can kill you from hand in a single turn, but that is either extremely difficult to pull off from a like, you know, combination of cards and order and whatever needed perspective, or can be disrupted in a meaningful way with cards that are actually reasonable to play. Like if you compare Hearthstone and Magic, Magic has combo decks, but I don't mind combo decks in Magic because Magic has duress. Magic has counter magic. Magic has all sorts of things that you can interact with your opponent trying to do a thing that goes over the top of your basic sort of mid-range creature, whatever game plan. Hearthstone does not. Hearthstone has extremely limited disruption in the form of things like Dirty Rat, where you have to kind of like hope you're playing at the right time and hope you get lucky and hit the right card. And like right now, in the current pre-patch metagame, several of the best decks in the format are like OTK combo decks. There's like Alonius Druid is arguably the best pre-patch deck, and it, you know, is getting the nerf of Marin, it's getting the nerf of Dorian, but those aren't even necessarily like cards that are essential to the deck functioning. So I'm skeptical that this set of changes is going to be sufficient to make the metagame once Into the Great Dark Beyond launches one that is amenable to the primary goals that the expansion has, which is, you know, hey, this is about doing these like mid to late game starship related things. I hope I'm wrong, right? I hope that these changes are enough so that the decks that like will just explode you from hand and ignore all the cool cards that you're trying to play to build your starship, you can't just ignore that, right? Like, but like there's still Alonius Druid, there's still like Sonya Rogue, there's still so many things that do the sort of thing that I'm talking about that like largely invalidate you trying to play a like mid to late game board-based strategy. And I think that that's a real problem for Hearthstone, broadly speaking, moving forward. And I don't know that there's easy ways to change this. And when I was talking to people about this fairly recently, I was like, I think it's a problem. There's so much combo kill, OTK style stuff. And it's like what? And I could literally list off like half a dozen decks that could like relatively consistently, kill in a single turn. And again, it's not a matter of like, how good they are necessarily, but I think things like Sonya Rogue, again, Elonius Druid, like Spell Mage that can like, or just like the regular, even non-Elonius, like spell powered Druid decks. All those decks are capable of like just nuking in a single turn through a lot of like board and even, a lot of forms of disruption. And I feel like it is just a frustrating world to live in when you are trying to do, again, what the new set like encourages you to do. And it's not out yet, right? But like we've seen enough to know that like the sort of fundamental goals are like, around these starship things. And you don't feel like you feel foolish for doing it, right? The number of times that I've played Hearthstone recently and played like 2 games and then just turned the game off because like I just got OTK'd again is very high. And that's why I have not been streaming Hearthstone lately. But I'm going to try it. We're going to hope that these changes are enough to at least mitigate a lot of the issues that I have been experiencing, and I imagine a lot of other people have as well, with, these sort of either spew a bunch of stuff into the board early or get blown up from hand late. That was a lot to say that, while I think that these nerfs are both in specifics and in direction doing the right thing, I am curious to see if they are enough, but we'll see. So anyway, let me know what you think. Do you expect that these nerfs will shift the balance of standard sufficiently so that mid-range minion decks, like the new expansion seems to be supporting, will be able to be viable? Or will we just all be living in Elonius and Sonya's worlds? So anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.